commit such acts and to strengthen the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. On Monday, I joined Karen Bass, the chair of the Crime Subcommittee, as well as the Congressional Black Caucus, in introducing the Justice and Policing Act, which would further that cause. The bill now has over 200 co-sponsors in the House and 36 co-sponsors in the Senate. I want to make clear at the outset that the bill is not an indictment of all police officers. We must always remember that most law enforcement officers do their jobs with dignity, selfless, and honor, and they are deserving of our respect and gratitude for all they do to keep us safe. We owe a debt that can never be paid to the too many officers killed in the line of duty every year. And it is clear that there are many officers, including some local police chiefs who marched arm in arm with their communities, who want to separate themselves from the dangerous behavior of others in the profession. But there are too many officers who abuse their authority. And we cannot be blind to the racism and injustice that pervades far too many of our law enforcement agencies. And injustice that the nation is demanding that we enact meaningful change. This is a systemic problem that requires a comprehensive solution. That is why the Justice and Policing Act takes a holistic approach that includes a variety of front-end reforms to change the culture of law enforcement while also holding bad police officers accountable to separate them from those with a true ethic to protect and serve. Among other things, the bill would make it easier for the federal government to successfully prosecute police misconduct cases. It would ban chokeholds. It would end racial and religious profiling. It would encourage prosecutions independent from local police, and it would eliminate the dubious court-made doctrine of qualified immunity for law enforcement. At the same time, the bill encourages departments to meet a gold standard in training, hiring, eliminate the dubious court-made doctrine of qualified immunity for law enforcement. At the same time, the bill encourages departments to meet a gold standard in training, hiring, de-escalation strategies, bystander duty, and use of body cameras and other best practices. It also creates a new grant program for community-based organizations to create local task forces on policing innovation that would reimagine public safety so that it is just and equitable for all Americans. The goal of this legislation is to achieve a guardian, not warrior, model of policing. The Justice and Policing Act is at once bold and transformative to meet the moment that calls out for sweeping reform, while also taking a responsible and balanced approach to the many complicated issues associated with policing. I look forward to bringing it before our committee in short order. To the activists who have been sounding the alarm for years only to be ignored or greeted with half measures, it is because of your persistence and your determination that we are here today. If there is one thing I have taken away from the tragic events of the last month, it is that the nation demands and deserves meaningful change. We can and should debate the specifics, but at the end of the day, it is the responsibility and the obligation of the House Judiciary Committee to do everything in our power to help deliver that change for the American people. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience on the many issues we are examining today and who will help guide us in that process. But first, I want to address just one witness, Philonise Floyd, the brother of George Floyd. We are all very sorry for your loss, and we appreciate your being here today to discuss your brother's life. We must remember that he is not just a cause, a name to be chanted in the streets. He was a man. He had a family. He was known as a gentle giant. He had a rich life that was taken away from him far too early, and we mourn his loss. This is a very difficult time for our nation. We have lost more than 110,000 people to COVID-19, a toll that has fallen disproportionately on people of color. We have lost brave police officers and other frontline workers who risked their lives to serve their communities. And we have lost George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the many, many other victims of excessive force by law enforcement. We must act today to honor their memory. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today and extend our sympathy to Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs. We are, as the chairman said, all so sorry for your loss and for what your families have had to live through and had to endure. Mr. Floyd, the murder of your brother in the custody of the Minneapolis police is a tragedy. Never should have happened. It's as wrong can be, and your brother's killers will face justice. Ms. Underwood Jacobs, the murder of your brother by the rioters in Oakland is a tragedy. It never should have happened. It's as wrong can be, and your brother's killers will face justice. There are 330 million people in this great country, the greatest nation ever. Not perfect, but the best nation ever. And they understand, the American people understand it's time for a real discussion, real debate, real solutions about police treatment of African Americans. Americans also understand that peaceful protest, exercising their First Amendment liberties, honors George Floyd's memory, and it helps that discussion, that debate, and those solutions actually happen. The people of this great country, you know what else they understand? You know what else they get? They understand that there is a big difference between peaceful protest and rioting. There is a big difference between peaceful protest and looting. There is a big difference between peaceful protest and violence and attacking innocent people. And there is certainly a big difference between peaceful protest and killing police officers. You know what else they get? You know what else the American people fully understand? They know, as the chairman said, the vast majority of law enforcement officers are responsible, hardworking, heroic first responders. They're the officers who protect the Capitol, who protect us every single day. They're the officers who rushed into the Twin Towers on 9/11. They're the officers in every one of our neighborhoods, in every one of our communities, every day, every night, every shift they work, who put their lives on the line to keep our communities safe. And guess what Americans also get? Guess what else they understand? They know it is pure insanity to defund the police. And the fact that my Democrat colleagues won't speak out against this crazy policy is just that frightening. Think about what we've heard in the last few weeks. We've heard the mayors of our two largest cities, Mayor Garcetti said he wants to defund the police. The mayor of New York says he wants to defund the police. The city council in Minneapolis, a veto-proof majority, says they want to defund the police and abolish the department. This Congress started off with the Democrats, folks on the left saying we should abolish ICE, then moved to we should abolish the entire Department of Homeland Security, and now they're talking about abolishing the police. This is wrong, and the American people know it's wrong. We should honor the memory of George Floyd and work hard so that nothing like it ever happens again. And we should honor the memory of Dave Patrick Underwood and work hard so that nothing like that ever happens again. A week and a half ago, our mission was clearly stated. 11 days ago in Florida, the President of the United States clearly stated what our mission should be. President Trump said this: "I stand before you as a friend and ally to every American seeking justice and peace, and I stand before you in firm opposition to anyone exploiting tragedy to loot, rob, attack, and menace. Healing, not hatred, justice, not chaos, are the mission at hand." Well said, Mr. President. Healing, not hatred, justice, not chaos. That is our mission. The President is right, and I appreciate his leadership. This is the House Judiciary Committee, with its storied history of defending the Constitution and the rule of law. Let's adopt that mission. Healing, not hatred, justice, not chaos. Let's work together to make America the great place, to continue to make America the greatest nation ever. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank you for your years of leadership on this issue. I know you've been involved for many years supporting police reform. And I want to thank you for convening this hearing today. What we saw in Minnesota, the slow, torturous murder of George Floyd by a uniformed officer, was an outrage and a tragedy. What we have seen since then, millions of Americans marching in the street to demand justice and call for reforms, it has been an inspiration. And minus a few days of violence, it has been peaceful, and it has been in the American tradition. And what we have here today is a hearing in the U.S. Congress to examine policing practices in America and paths to reform. And so we have an opportunity. What we have seen since then is an opportunity to rethink the nature of policing, an opportunity for meaningful accountability in policing, and it is an opportunity to show the nation and the world that we are listening and that we will act. Too often this debate is framed in terms of citizens versus the police, us versus them, but this is really about the kind of America we all want to see. We all want to be safe in our communities. We all want the police to come to our rescue when we're in trouble. We all want to support the brave men and women who put their lives on the line for us every day. And when we interact with police, we all want to be treated with respect, not suspicion. Nobody should be subjected to harassment or excessive force just because of the color of their skin, and no one should suffer the indignities of racial profiling or be on the end of a deadly chokehold. We should all want for ourselves and for our children and for our neighbors the same. On Monday, I introduced, along with Chairman Nadler and more than 200 members of Congress, H.R. 7120, the Justice and Policing Act. This bold, transformative legislation would help reimagine the culture of policing while holding accountable those officers who failed to uphold the ethic of serving and protecting their communities. I know later, when we do a markup, we will entertain an amendment to change the name of the legislation in honor of George Floyd. If this had been a law last year, George Floyd would be alive because chokeholds would be banned. Breonna Taylor would be alive because no-knock warrants for drugs would be banned. Tamir Rice would have graduated high school this May because the officer that killed him, had been fired from a nearby department, and he lied on his application. But this legislation calls for a national registry, so that would not have happened, and Tamir Rice would have graduated high school. I understand that change is difficult, but I am certain that police officers are professionals who risk their lives every day, and they're just as interested in building a strong relationship with the communities that they serve based on mutual trust and respect as those who rely on their protection are. They want to increase and upgrade the profession, and so having national standards, it should never be that you can do a chokehold in one city and not in another. There should be basic standards, there should be basic accreditation, there should be continuing education, just as there are in so many other professions. When I was at the service yesterday, and when I was there, I looked up at the picture of George Floyd, and I saw the year that he was born. He was born in 1973. And that was an important year in my life because that was the year in Los Angeles that I joined an organization called the Coalition Against Police Abuse. That was 47 years ago. Our police chief at the time, we were suffering from a number of victims who had died because of chokeholds. Our police chief held a press conference where he told Los Angeles that the reason why black people died of chokeholds was because our neck veins were different. They didn't open up as rapidly as normal people. That's where we were 47 years ago. The question remains for us, though. It was 29 years ago that we saw the Rodney King beating. And as an activist at the time, I was sad at the tragedy. It was horrific to see him beat like that. But most of the activists said, finally, we know we'll have justice. There's no way these police officers are going to get off because the whole world saw what happened. In the civil rights movement, what led to the great change in the end of legal segregation, aside from the tens of thousands of people that protested, it was the fact that there were cameras there. The beatings, the treatment of black people in the South had gone on for, frankly, hundreds of years, but it wasn't until those cameras exposed that then things began to change. And so what has happened in the 29 years since Rodney King with the advent of cell phone cameras? We have seen example after example after example. 29 years since Rodney King, 20 years since Amadou Diallo, 6 years since Eric Gardner, just weeks since the death of George Floyd. His death cannot be in vain. I told his brother that his name will live on in history because the tragedy that he suffered has been the catalyst for what I believe will be profound change. And not just change that helps to professionalize police departments, not just change that prevents further abuse and deaths, but an opportunity for communities through receiving grants to take a look at their community and say, well, there's all of these issues that we face. Why should police officers have to address homelessness and mental illness? Police officers complain all the time. They're not social workers. That's right. So with these grants, maybe communities can take an opportunity to re-envision what public safety is and come up with models, better models to work with police, better models to reduce the problems that wind up needing a police officer. So that's what we have an opportunity to do in this Congress with this piece of legislation. And I hope that we work for passage of this legislation in the House, it gets through the Senate, the President signs it, and in the year 2020, we never, ever, ever see again what we saw a few weeks ago. It wasn't just a tragedy for our country and our nation, but it really was an embarrassment of our nation in front of the entire world. While we hold up human rights in the world, we obviously have to hold them up in our country. And with that, I yield.
Thank you. Since Mr. Ratcliffe, the former ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, has left the committee to serve as Director of National Intelligence, I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join all my colleagues today in thanking all of our witnesses sincerely for being here, and especially Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs for making the trip in the midst of such tragedy and difficult circumstances to share your experiences with us. It's very valuable to us, and we're grateful. Of course, you have our condolences and our profound sadness for your losses. And I and my family and the community of faith that I represent have been praying for you and will continue to do that. We're going to talk about policing practices and reforms today, and that's a really important topic. But since this is the first full committee hearing that we've had in judiciary since the tragic death of Mr. Floyd, I think it's also important for us to acknowledge here in the beginning what's believed by so many to be a root cause of the persistent challenges we face together as a country, and that is the need for authentic reconciliation in our communities. Everyone here understands the plain and simple truth that racism in any form violates the most fundamental principles of our great nation and the rules of our Creator. The central idea of America, let's not forget, is the idea that we boldly declare the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and that they're thus endowed by God with the same inalienable rights. Because each of us is made in the image of God, there are very serious implications that come from that. Among them is the idea that every single person has inestimable dignity and value. And our value is not related in any way to the color of our skin or what zip code we live in or what we can contribute to society or anything else. Our value is inherent because it comes to us by our Creator. Any fool who contends he has some sort of natural right of supremacy over his neighbor violates not only the foundational creed of America, but the greatest commandments of the God who made him. And if we can ever learn to see one another as God does, I think it'll solve a lot of our problems. This unspeakable act of cruelty that America witnessed in Minneapolis has opened an important new dialogue on reform. And while policing has always been regarded as an inherently local function, we do agree that Congress has a key role to play in ensuring that abuses are not tolerated and can never happen again. Justice has to be swift, and bad police officers have to be held accountable for their actions. But at the same time, we want to be careful to recognize, as all my colleagues have this morning, that officers like the ones involved in the death of George Floyd are not representative of the vast majority of America's law enforcement officers. Most are faithful, self-sacrificing public servants who put their lives on the line every single day to protect and serve our communities. We need to honor that, and we need to recognize and empower those law enforcement officers, which is precisely the opposite of the radical, dangerous proposals we're seeing right now to defund them. A government of, by, and for the people must be a nation of law and order, and public safety, of course, is the key to maintaining our republic. Without that, things like the rioting, looting, and violence that has led to the destruction of cities and minority-owned businesses, ironically, would prevail over the valuable, peaceful protests that are intended to bring about meaningful change. There's a consensus among every member of this committee, Democrat and Republican, that there are solutions we can work towards that will restore faith in our institutions and build trust in our communities. From where we sit right now, we believe the most actionable reforms must focus around three core concepts to simplify it: transparency, training, and termination of those rare bad apples in law enforcement who violate the law and the legitimacy that upholds the character of our legal system. This common ground is key if we're going to accomplish the goal of keeping our communities safe, upholding the civil liberties of individuals, and protecting the legitimacy of law enforcement. None of these goals that I've outlined today are mutually exclusive, of course. We can and should clearly condemn the senseless violence we've seen and all causes of it, from a few bad apples wearing a badge to the bad actors and anarchists sparking riots and destruction in our streets. At the same time, we can work together on meaningful reforms and real results while upholding the respect and appreciation that is due to every American patriot who faithfully serves us on the thin blue line. I have faith that we can work together as a committee. This is a bipartisan concern, and we'll have bipartisan solutions, I hope. For the future of our country and for generations of Americans to come, we have to do that. I urge my colleagues in this moment, all of us, to hear and to listen to our witnesses and work with each other as friends and fellow Americans to understand the need in our communities and foster our discussions on a foundation of civility and mutual respect. We've started that, and I hope we can continue it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We have an unusually large panel today, but given the broad range of issues that we will be discussing, we have invited a broad range of witnesses. As is customary, the minority was given the opportunity to invite witnesses as well, and they have selected Mr. Bongino, Pastor Scott, and Ms. Underwood Jacobs. We welcome everyone and thank them for their participation. Now, if the witnesses would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, for those witnesses testifying in person, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. For our remote participants, there is a timer on your screen to help you keep track of time. Given the large number of witnesses, I will introduce each witness and then invite him or her to give his or her testimony before introducing the next witness. We will begin with Mr. Floyd. Philanese Floyd is the brother of George Floyd, who was killed by Minneapolis police officers on May 25th. Mr. Floyd has spoken eloquently about his brother's life, and we appreciate his being with us today, having flown to Washington to testify before us today directly from his brother's funeral in Houston yesterday. We are all so sorry for your loss. Mr. Floyd, you may begin.
Thank you. Chairman Gerald Nadler and members of the committee. Chairman Gerald Nadler and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation here today to talk about my big brother, George. The world knows him as George, but I called him Perry. Yesterday, we laid him to rest. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do. I'm the big brother now, so it's my job to comfort my brothers and my sisters, Perry's kids, and everyone who loved him. And that's a lot of people. I have to be the strong one now because George is gone. And me being the big brother now is why I'm here today. To do what Perry always would have done. To take care of the family and others. I couldn't take care of George that day he was killed, but maybe by speaking with you today, I can make sure that his death will not be in vain. To make sure that he is more than another face on a t-shirt, more than another name on a list that won't stop growing, George always made sacrifices for our family, and he made sacrifices for complete strangers. He gave the little that he had to help others. He was our gentle giant. I was reminded of that when I watched the video of his murder. He called all the officers sir. He was mild-mannered. He didn't fight back. He listened to all the officers. The man who took his life, who suffocated him for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he still called them sir as he begged for his life. I can't tell you the kind of pain you feel when you watch something like that. When you watch your big brother, who you looked up to your whole entire life, die begging for his mom. I'm tired. I'm tired of pain. Pain you feel when you watch something like that. When you watch your big brother, who you looked up to for your whole life, die begging for his mom. I'm here to ask you to make it stop. Stop the pain. Stop us from being tired. George called for help and he was ignored. Please listen to the call I'm making to you now, to the calls of our family and the calls ringing out the streets across the world. People of all backgrounds, genders, and races have come together to demand change. Honor them, honor George, and make the necessary changes that make law enforcement the solution and not the problem. Hold them accountable when they do something wrong. Teach them what it means to treat people with empathy and respect. Teach them what necessary force is. Teach them that deadly force should be used rarely and only when life is at risk. George wasn't hurting anyone that day. He didn't deserve to die over $20. I'm asking you, is that what a black man is worth? $20? This is 2020. Enough is enough. The people marching in the streets are telling you enough is enough. By the leaders that in our country, the world needs the right thing. The people elected you to speak for them, to make positive change. George's name means something. You have the opportunity here today to make your names mean something too. If his death ends up changing the world for the better, and I think it will, then he died as he lived. It is on you to make sure his death is not in vain. I didn't get the chance to say goodbye to Perry while he was here. I was robbed of that. But I know he's looking down at us now. Perry, look up at what you did. Big brother, you changed the world. Thank you for everything, for taking care of us when on earth, for taking care of us now. I hope you found Mama and you can rest in peace with power. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Floyd. Vanita Gupta is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Ms. Gupta previously served as an acting assistant attorney general at the Department of Justice and led the department's Civil Rights Division. She received her JD from New York University School of Law and her BA from Yale University. Ms. Gupta, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Mr. Floyd, thank you for being here today and for those incredibly powerful words, and we are so sorry. Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. And thank you, Chairman Nadler, for calling this hearing on policing practices and the need for transformative policies that promote accountability, begin to reimagine public safety, and respect the dignity of all people. While the recent murder of George Floyd at the hands of 4 Minneapolis police officers put the issue of police brutality in the national spotlight, the outpouring of pain and anger is anything but a reaction to one isolated incident or the misconduct of a few bad apples. Instead, the outcry is a response to the long cycle of stolen lives and violence with impunity toward Black people in our nation. We are now at a turning point. There is no returning to normal. We have to create a new way forward, one that does more than tinker at the edges, that promotes data and training. We need something that truly transforms policing and leads to more accountability for communities. It is imperative that we get this right, and that Congress's response in this moment appropriately reflects and acknowledges the important work of Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, and so many people that are bringing us to this tipping point. My tenure as head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division began 2 months after 18-year-old Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson. The Justice Department was hardly perfect, but we understood our mandate to promote accountability and constitutional policing in order to build community trust. During the Obama administration, we opened 25 pattern or practice investigations to help realize greater structural and community-centered change, often at the request of police chiefs and mayors who needed federal leadership. After making findings, we negotiated consent decrees with extensive engagement and input from community advocates who not only identified unjust and unlawful policing practices, but also helped develop sustainable mechanisms for accountability and systemic change. That is not the Justice Department that we have today. Under both Attorneys General Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, the department has abdicated its responsibility and abandoned the use of tools like pattern and practice investigations and consent decrees. Instead, it is focused on dismantling police accountability efforts and halting any new investigations. The disruption of crucial work in the Civil Rights Division and throughout the Department of Justice to bring forth accountability and transparency in policing is deeply concerning. In the absence of federal leadership, the Leadership Conference Education Fund launched the New Era of Public Safety Initiative, a comprehensive guide and toolkit outlining proposals to build trust between communities and police departments, restore confidence, and imagine a new paradigm of public safety. While much of these changes must happen at the state and local level,
It's 21
success
hours.
is going to require the leadership, support, and commitment of the federal government, including Congress. Last week, the Leadership Conference and more than 400 civil rights organizations sent a letter to Congress to move us forward on a path of true accountability. The recommendations included the following. 1, create a national necessary standard on the use of force. 2, prohibit racial profiling, including robust data collection. 3, ban the use of chokeholds and other restraint maneuvers. 4, end the militarization of policing. 5, prohibit the use of no-knock warrants, especially in drug cases. 6, strengthen federal accountability systems and increase the Justice Department's authority to prosecute officers that engage in misconduct. 7, create a national police misconduct registry. And 8, end qualified immunity. The Leadership Conference was pleased to learn that the Justice and Policing Act, introduced Monday by both members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, reflects much of this accountability framework. This is Congress's most comprehensive effort in decades to substantially address police misconduct by taking on critical issues affecting Black and brown communities. And as the bill advances toward passage, we will continue to work on it and to ensure that real change is achieved. But let me just say in closing that policing reform alone is not going to solve the crisis that we're in today. This moment of reckoning requires leaders, together with communities, to envision a new paradigm of public safety that respects the human rights of all people. That means not just changing policing practices and culture, but ultimately shrinking the footprint of the criminal legal system in Black and brown people's lives. And it means shifting our approach to public safety from exclusively focusing on criminalization and policing towards investments in economic opportunity, education, healthcare, and other public benefits. Police chiefs and officers talk about the same thing. This approach will not only further equity, but also constitute effective policy. When we stop using criminal justice policy as social policy, we will make communities safer and more prosperous. Now is the time for Congress to pass lasting accountability measures, and we look forward to working with you until the day that these reforms are signed into law. George Floyd's death has impacted the world, and now it is on us to change it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without objection, at the request of the ranking member, I will now recognize the distinguished Minority Leader of the House for a brief introduction of his constituent, our next witness, Angela Underwood Jacobs.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Jordan, for convening this very important hearing. Mr. Floyd, thank you for your powerful words. I'll make one promise to you: your brother will not have died in vain. I'm here to introduce Angela Underwood Jacobs, her husband Michael, and her daughter Trinity. More importantly, I'm here to listen to them and all of you. Now, I know Angela, and I'm proud to call her a friend. She is a mother, a businesswoman, and the first black woman to become a city council member in Lancaster, California. Angela is here to testify because her brother, Dave Patrick Underwood, he was tragically and senselessly murdered in the line of duty 2 weeks ago in Oakland. We mourn and pray for Angela and the entire Underwood and Floyd family. As a member of the Federal Protective Service, Pat was guarding a federal courthouse, a symbol of equal justice and the rule of law, during the riots in Oakland on the night of his death. It appears his death was part of a targeted attack on federal law enforcement. We pray that justice comes swiftly and completely for Pat, for George Floyd, and all victims of violence. Pat Underwood should be alive today. George Floyd should be alive today. David Dern should be alive today. And so should countless others. And though we cannot bring them back, we can learn from their lives and deliver the justice and change they deserve. I hope that every member of this committee will listen closely and carefully to what Angela has to say. Our nation must listen, and it must heal. Like Dr. King, we must reconcile our differences with a renewed sense of love and compassion. Like President Lincoln, we must remember that we are not enemies, but we are friends. Friends that have a responsibility to rise above, to make sure we all become the more perfect union we strive to be. And I hope at this moment in time, we rise to the occasion. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Ms. Underwood Jacobs, you may begin.
Thank you very much, and I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As a nation, as a people, we must come together to defeat fear, hate, prejudice, and violence. I want to ensure the memory of my brother, Patrick, is as a catalyst against injustice, intolerance, and violence of any kind. I want to honor my brother, Dave Patrick Underwood, and our family, and help our nation think about how to navigate the righteous path to equality, freedom, and nonviolent systemic change. I want to extend my sympathies and condolences to George Floyd's family. Mr. Floyd's murder was just not cruel and reprehensible, but criminal. The officers involved should be brought to justice and held accountable for their actions or as well as their inaction. I wish that same justice for my brother Patrick, who served with distinction and honor as a federal officer for the Department of Homeland Security, until he was murdered anonymously by blind violence on the steps of the federal courthouse in Oakland, California. As he took his last breath on the cold, hard cement after being shot multiple times, he died. Fear, hatred, ignorance, and blind violence snatched the life of my brother Patrick from all of us. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached, "Always avoid violence. If you succumb to the temptation of using violence in your struggle, unborn generations will be recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness. And your chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos." I have spoken to many people across this country, in fact, across the world, regarding what is going on in America. America is in pain, and she is crying. Can you hear her? I am here to seek justice through the chaos for my brother Patrick, for George Floyd, for citizens of all colors, for communities across America, and for the police officers that protect those communities and their citizens every day. The actions of a few are dividing us as a nation. At a time when we should be coming together and uniting for the well-being of all people. We will never solve generational systemic injustice with looting, burning, destruction of property, and killing in the name of justice. We must find lawful, peaceful solutions that uplift and benefit everyone. And this is greater than a black, white, or blue issue. It is a humanity issue. When those in a position of authority choose to abuse their power, that is the very definition of oppression. And when innocent people are harmed in the name of justice, no one prevails, we all lose. Everyone deserves the opportunity to feel heard, be seen, and feel safe. Police brutality of any kind must not be condoned. However, it is blatantly wrong to create an excuse out of discrimination and disparity to loot and burn our communities, to kill our officers of the law. It is a ridiculous solution to proclaim that defunding police departments is a solution to police brutality and discrimination, because it's not a solution. It gets us nowhere as a nation and removes the safety net of protection that every citizen deserves from their community's elected officials. There is a path to achieving what we desire and deserve as a nation and as a people: equality, fairness, justice, peace, and freedom from oppression. It is the same path we started on during the Civil Rights Movement. The solution to our nation's ills are straightforward. Education. We need to actually invest in education again and make it our nation's top priority. Through education comes knowledge, through knowledge comes understanding, and through understanding comes opportunity and freedom. Jobs. If there isn't any chance of making a decent living, there isn't any chance of having a decent, just society. We need to create more jobs that in turn will create more economic justice for all Americans. Housing. There is no way to live a decent life if you can't find, or in America's case, afford shelter. We need to listen and learn from each other. It's time for everyone to open their ears and listen to what each other has to say. America is the world's melting pot because we have so many people, cultures, beliefs, and points of view. And somehow we've become siloed. As a single voice in this chambers, attempting to honor my brother and family, I hope I can make a difference today. I want America to make a change. I want you as our representatives in Congress to make a change so that no one ever has to wake up to the phone call that I received telling me that my brother was shot dead and murdered. How my brother died was wrong, and I'm praying that we learn something about how he lived. Patrick was the type of man that when our mother fell to the ground as she was dying, he picked her lifeless body up as her spirit was leaving to place her upon her bed because that's where she wanted to die. My question is, who will pick up Patrick and carry his legacy? I believe this is a responsibility for all of us. Please do not let my brother Patrick's name go in vain. Patrick was a good man who only wanted to help others and keep his community safe. He had an infectious laugh and a corny sense of humor. He would go out of his way to help family, friends, and strangers. He did not deserve to die in such a horrendously inhumane way. No one does. Now, my family is in a state of hollow disarray. We all feel the anxiety of wondering what tomorrow may bring or may not bring, which has struck fear in our hearts. Nevertheless, I wholeheartedly urge us all Americans, not to give in to hate and anger, but to resolve conflict with kindness and love, to lead with a sense of purpose and renewed energy to create positive change, as I have outlined here through education, jobs, housing, and listening. Pat didn't tell anyone how to live, but he lived. And what an amazing life it was. I will never forget the way my brother smiled and the way that he loved his family with every piece of his heart. My wish is for us to live and live without fear and discrimination. Do not simply tolerate your neighbor, but strive to understand one another. And we will be a better, more just society for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Art Acevedo, who serves as the chief of the Houston Police Department and also serves as president of the Major Cities Chiefs Association. Chief Acevedo received his BS in Public Administration from the University of La Verne. Chief Acevedo, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Underwood, Mr. Floyd, all of us at our condolences know that we're lifting you in our prayers. Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate virtually in today's hearing. It's good to be with all of you, and especially my Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee and Congresswoman Garcia. I want to thank Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee and Congresswoman Bass for their leadership. As the Major City Chiefs Association reviews the Justice and Policing Act, please know that we support the intent and look forward to working with the committee. I appear before you today as the Chief of Police in Houston, Texas, and it is also my privilege to testify on behalf of the Major City Chiefs Association as their president. No matter the circumstance, every time a life is taken, a loved one is taken. George Floyd was a child of God and raised in Houston. His death was deeply disturbing and a shock to the conscience. Over the past few days, I've had the opportunity to meet with the Floyd family, and I will continue to lift them in prayer. Mr. Floyd, thank you to you and your family for allowing us to join you on your brother's journey home. There is no denying that changes in policing must be made. Out of crisis comes opportunity, and this is an opportunity for all of us to have some tough conversations, to listen, to learn, and to enact meaningful reform that is long overdue. As a profession, we must learn what is being shared with us. That includes being honest about our history. We must acknowledge that law enforcement's past contains institutional racism, injustices, and brutality. We must acknowledge that policing has had a disparate treatment and impact on disenfranchised communities, especially communities of color and poor communities. Several topics have risen to the forefront, and all reforms must be vetted and ensure that they are sustainable, effective, and have no unintended consequences. Several topics have, law enforcement plays an important role. No two calls for service are the same, and in Houston, we respond to an average of 1.2 million calls for service annually. Those calls disproportionately originate from communities of color. If we are going to talk about better policing, we also need to talk about the root causes behind the need for those calls for service. Some think defunding the police is the answer. I'm here to tell you on behalf of our mayor and other mayors across the country and police chiefs across this country and the diverse communities that we serve, this is simply not the answer. Defunding the police without addressing the social economic reality faced by poor communities and the disenfranchised and how they are riddled with missteps which would increase the need for police services. History has shown that underfunding the police can have disastrous consequences and hurt those most in need of our services. Appropriate police funding is critical to ensure agencies have resources to invest in technology like body-worn cameras, recruit qualified police officers who are service-minded, and train in implicit bias, train in cultural competency, train in de-escalation, and other critical training. The overwhelming majority of cops are good people. This cannot be lost. They are faithful public servants who put their uniform on every day, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. We can't let, again, the actions of bad cops let us lose sight of the fact that most cops are good. We must all judge each other through the prism and content of our individual hearts and actions, and not through the prism of color and the uniform that we wear. While there is no national use of force standard and previous efforts at establishing one were met with disagreement, several components are ubiquitous throughout the U.S. Prioritization of the sanctity of life, duty to intervene, and the use of de-escalation tactics and techniques is a must. Let me be clear. The actions of the 4 officers involved in the death of Mr. Floyd are inconsistent, unjustified, and repulsive. They are contrary to the protocols of the policing profession, and they sabotage the law enforcement community's tireless efforts to build trust. Moving our profession forward begins with a sustained commitment to accountability. From the start of academy training, recruits must understand that they have an absolute duty to put public safety, service, and security first. In the Houston Police Department, we instill in our men and women the certainty that policy violations regarding truthfulness will lead to termination, or as we put it, if you lie, you die. It is important to note that every chief's administrative authorities are different across the nation, and that not everyone has the legal authority to take immediate action like Chief Arredondo did. I am encouraged that there have been eras in America's history when police have found it difficult to speak up. We are speaking up today. But let that be clear, for many years, officers have consistently been holding one another accountable, and complaints about police misconduct overwhelmingly originate from within agencies, not from members of the community. Communities have an absolute responsibility as well. We ask citizens to report police misconduct without fail. This will afford us the opportunity to investigate, track, and report those complaints. We must also address the issue of officers who have been terminated with cause only to get rehired by another department. Many of us refer to these individuals as gypsy cops. Many gypsy cops have exhibited troubling behavior, and that in turn undermines efforts to build trust with the public and efforts in terms of internal department accountability. Transparency breeds trust, and trust breeds respect. Mutual trust and respect between law enforcement and the public is crucial to good policing. The civil unrest occurring throughout our nation and throughout this entire country is a sobering reminder of how quickly we will lose public trust and the consequences of that fact. Ensuring the department looks more like the communities we serve helps build trust and confidence. Unique perspectives and insights help a department lead and serve the communities of color. I'm happy to report that the Major City Chiefs Association has several departments now that are minority majority, like the City of Houston and the Houston Police Department, and are reflective of the communities that we serve. On behalf of the Major City Chiefs, I want America to know that we hear you. We will continue to do everything in our power to facilitate your right to peacefully protest. The MCCA will not shy away from this challenge and will continue to be a leader and voice in the national discourse and race relations, policing, and reform. To the Floyd family and to the activists across the nation, our commitment is to be your voice, to join you, and to make sure that Mr. Floyd's death was not in vain. I yield the remainder of my time and look forward to any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Chief. Our next witness is Ms. Sherilyn Ifill. Ms. Sherilyn Ifill is the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She received her JD from New York University School of Law and her BA from Vassar College. Ms. Eiffel, you may begin.
Good morning. My name is Sherilyn Eiffel. I'm the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the nation's oldest civil rights legal organization formed in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan. I want to salute the leadership of Representative Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus on this issue. And I want to extend, on behalf of the Legal Defense Fund, my deepest condolences to the Floyd family and thank them for their courage and their voice at this important moment. We welcome the Justice in Policing Act as a first step in addressing the decades-long call and demand for policing reform. The legislation includes reforms that LDF's policing reform campaign has advocated for years to ensure greater accountability for police officers who engage in misconduct and brutality. Members of Congress incorporated a number of our proposals in the Act, which is a step in the right direction toward ensuring police accountability nationwide. I want to first focus this committee's attention on the significance of this moment and the importance of the federal government's role in addressing this crisis. You are in a civil rights moment. In 1964, 1965, 66, and 67, cities all over the North in this country were gripped by urban unrest. In Watts and Detroit, Harlem, Minneapolis, and scores of other cities, Black people took to the streets to protest police brutality. It was during that period of unrest that Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Riots are the language of the unheard." The 1968 Kerner Commission was created to study the source of that unrest. And much of the report's findings and recommendations focused on law enforcement presence and conduct in Black communities. This period overlapped with the years that most people think of as the core civil rights movement, when Black people in the South petitioned, protested, marched, and demanded federal legislation to address segregation, voter suppression, and economic injustice. The result were core civil rights statutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But despite the unrest in northern cities, in over 100 cities during that decade, there was no legislation to address the issue of police brutality in African American communities. And as a result, very little has changed since that period as it relates to this issue. Therefore, too many officers know that they can commit the most heinous acts against African Americans without fear of accountability. Ranking Member Jordan said that the killers of George Floyd will face justice. But we also know that those who killed Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Terrence Crutcher, Eleanor Bumpers, Michael Stewart, Clifford Glover, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, and countless others never were held accountable for the crimes they committed. That snapshot of former Officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on the neck of George Floyd with his hands in his pockets, looking out with no fear of being videotaped, should shame every member of this body, every judge, every lawyer, everyone who has participated in the perpetuation of a system that calls itself a justice system, but routinely allows officers of the state to take innocent life with impunity. You have the chance now to change that. One of the key parts of the system of impunity has been qualified immunity, a defense that shields officials from the unforeseeable consequences of their act, but has been interpreted by courts so expansively that it now provides near immunity for police officers who engage in unconstitutional acts of violence. LDF has litigated a number of these cases. For example, in 2018, we filed a petition in the United States Supreme Court appealing a decision of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit that affirmed summary judgment in favor of a law enforcement officer who tased our client, Carrie Illich, 19 times to death. The U.S. Supreme Court denied the petition, and this case was not a one-off. Every year, cert petitions are filed in the court seeking review of cases in which law enforcement officers have successfully eluded accountability for the most violent forms of brutality by raising the qualified immunity defense. The Justice in Policing Act seeks to address qualified immunity by amending the civil rights statute used most in police excessive use of force cases, 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, and we welcome this amendment. We want it to apply to all civil suits that are pending or filed after enactment of the Act, and we'll continue to work towards the elimination of qualified immunity. There's bipartisan support for ending qualified immunity, and so I'll close my remarks by quoting from a federal circuit court judge in a decision issued just this week in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. It was written by a judge appointed first to the bench by George W. Bush. And he said in Jones versus City of Martinsburg, Judge Henry Floyd said, Wayne Jones was killed just 1 year before the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of Michael Brown would once again draw national scrutiny to police shootings of Black people in the United States. 7 years later, we're asked to decide whether it was clearly established that 5 officers could not shoot a man 22 times as he lay motionless on the ground. Before the ink dried on this opinion, the FBI opened an investigation into the death of yet another Black man at the hands of police, this time George Floyd in Minneapolis. This has to stop. To award qualified immunity at the summary judgment stage in this case would signal absolute immunity for fear-based use of force, which we cannot accept. This decision represents a minority of cases, and so we need Congress to act. You are required by history to meet this civil rights moment. It is a moment in which we have a chance to transform our approach to public safety, to recognize that most community conflicts do not require the intervention of an armed officer, and to speak our values through federal and state budgets that prioritize our commitment to anti-discrimination, to public health, and to true public safety for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Darrell Scott, who is the founder and senior pastor of the New Spirit Revival Center, a non-denominational church in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Pastor Scott is also the author of the book, Nothing to Lose, Unlikely Allies in the Struggle for a Better Black America. Pastor Scott, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, members of committee, Ranking Member Jordan, thank you for inviting me to participate in these very serious hearings today. I want to begin by stating that the prospect of defunding and or dismantling police forces across the country is one of the most unwise, irresponsible proposals by American politicians in our nation's history and makes absolutely no sense at all, at least to me. I believe it is nothing short of the politicizing of current social events in an effort to garner votes during this election season. I also believe that it's a reactionary measure that can and will result in short and long-term damage to American society, particularly in our inner city and urban communities. Now, I recognize the fact that the elimination of excessive force and physical retaliation by officers of the law against American citizens is paramount today. I recognize the fact that racial profiling and the harsh treatment of minorities is a very real reality that must be eliminated immediately. I myself can testify of times in my life when I felt racially profiled by police. I can testify of times in my life when I was pulled over for driving while Black. I can testify of giving my grandson, who is now of driving age, the talk of how to properly behave if pulled over by police because he had the question of a very real fear of the possibility of death at the hands of police. In fact, my very first interaction with police when I was 13 years old resulted in me being roughed up. I could very easily have been George Floyd. George Floyd could have very easily been me, my brothers, my friends, or any number of any other Black men in America. However, I do not recommend throwing the baby out with the bathwater by labeling all police officers as bad cops simply because of the bad actions of a rogue segment of those whose job is supposed to be to protect and to serve American citizens. In fact, in certain inner city communities across America, increased funding for police and increased police presence is actually necessary in order to enforce the law and to guarantee the safety and the security of law-abiding members of those communities. As one who was formerly in that street life years ago, I might be a pastor, but I didn't come down from heaven. I came up out of hell with the rest of everybody else. I was formerly in that street life. I know very much about the criminal element, and I can state definitively that the criminal element in and of society would enjoy nothing better than a reduction in police presence and police power. It would allow those with criminal intentions and criminal actions to flourish virtually unchallenged in the communities of America. The law-abiding members of society would be directly threatened by the absence of police or the inability of police to respond to criminal activities, and in many cases would endeavor to take the law into their own hands to ensure their safety and well-being, as evidenced by the response of some who decided to defend themselves and their property from vandalism. An absence of police presence could potentially give rise to acts of domestic terrorism, mob rule, gang rule, neighborhood intimidation, oppression, and vigilantism. Defunding of police departments has already happened in a number of American cities, and rather than remedying problems, has actually made conditions much worse. The city of Cleveland, my hometown, is a prime example of the results of police defunding. In 2004, the city of Cleveland laid off 285 officers. The entire police budget was slashed by 31%. To cover basic services, the following units were either disbanded or cut forever. The district strike force units, the narcotics unit was completely cut. SWAT was downsized. The fugitive unit was disbanded. The auto theft unit was disbanded. The intelligence unit was cut to bare bones. The mounted unit was cut 85%. The aviation unit was down completely for 3 years and is now only utilized during special events.